Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second class on Hafrashat Hallah and separating the dough when making bread. I just want to summarize what we talked about right at the end of last week. We were talking about thick batter versus thin batter, and we were talking about whether the dough was being baked, fried, or cooked. So if it's cooked or fried, it doesn't matter if it is thick batter or thin batter. It's just you don't need to take challah, and if you want to take challah, that's a good thing, but obviously no beracha. When it is baked in the oven, if it is thick, everyone agrees that if you made enough flour has been used, then you would have to make a beracha and to take challah. But if it is less than the amount, then obviously one wouldn't make it. When it's thin and it's really not designed for that, even if it's in the oven, most poskim hold that you don't. So if I bring up this picture here, got a little summary page here, it's basically got it here. When it's belila ava, thick dough or thick batter, if it's baked, then you're going to separate it with a beracha, provided that you've done enough, that the amount is there. When it's fried or boiled, it's a machloket, so therefore we separate it without a bracha. And then we have the belila raka, it's thin, and therefore separate it with a bracha, but that's only if it's really thick. I mean, again, I wouldn't do this. I mean, just the thin stuff, it just changes the whole nature of it. And if it's fried and boiled, then it's totally exempt. Now, this is the main question where people ask the questions, and that is, how much dough, how much flour, how much bread am I making that I need to make a beracha when I am making challah? So not just, I'll take some just to remove safek, not to remove doubt, but this is actual vadai. Everyone agrees, chutz la'aretz, in the diaspora, in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, everyone agrees that you would need to make a beracha. So here's what we're going to get into. So it says as follows, Gemara in Eruvin. Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis taught in a Braita, Reshit arisotechem. It should be the first of your dough. Kedei isotechem. So you shall set apart this amount. But the question is, v'kama isotechem. How much is your dough? And it says, Kedei isat hamidbar. How much? It's the amount of dough which they did in the desert. Well, that's not really going to help me. How much dough did they have in the wilderness? Well, it does tell us there. Dichtiv, how much manna did they eat? V'ha'omer asirit ha'efa hu. And an omer's worth, how much manna did they eat? 1/10 of an ephah. Mikan amru, from here we learn that what? Shiva reve'im kemach ve'od chayevet b'chala. If you take, and here's going to get a little bit more complicated, and I apologize, 7/4 of a kav of flour, then one is obligated to take challah. And how much is that? Shehen shisha shel Yerushalmit, shehen chamisha shel tzipori. This is equal to 6 quarter calves of the Jerusalem measure, which is 5 quarter calves of the Tzipori measure. Now, you heard me right there. It's either 7 quarters, 6 quarters, or 5 quarters. So how many fourths do I need in order to make that? And can you tell me how many ounces of flour is that? How many cups of flour is that? I don't understand. What does that mean in real parlance? So let it get a little bit more complicated. Rashi tells us it's 43 1/5 eggs. He says it here. Mem gimel beitzim v'chomesh beitzah. 43 eggs and 1/5. And again, we talk about the machloket of how much a kazayat is. I don't want to get into how much a beitzah is. So I've got 43.2 eggs. How much is that? So let's have a look. The Shulchan Aruch tells us, Ve'ein chayav, and one is only obligated when you take chameshet reve'im, 5/4, or 5/4 calves. Umidah shemachazik 43 beitzim v'chomesh beitzan. He quotes the language of Rashi, which is 43 1/5 eggs, or 43.2 eggs. Okay? And when one fills up the measuring utensil with flour, it should be smoothed out and not heaped. And the weight of 5/4 flour is 520 dram from wheat flour in Egypt. And again, thank you very much, Shulchan Aruch. Who's going to help me out with what 520 dram of Egyptian? I don't have that on my measuring scale. So what does that mean? And if that isn't enough, Rav Moshe Isserles, he wants to give us another measurement here, a utensil that holds 10 fingers by 10 fingers, which is a height of 3 and approximately 1/9 of a finger. That is the measurement for Hallah. Similarly, a utensil that has 7 fingers minus 2/9 of a finger, with a height of 7 fingers minus 2/9 of a finger, that is the Omer. And all these finger measurements are with the width of the thumb of the hand. Now, again, I'm sorry, I must have been living in the wrong time, but clearly this is a standard in 16th century Poland, that you go like this. There's my 4, there's 3. That's how big. I've got nothing for you. I really have no idea what that is. I can't tell you. Again, it's telling me it's the width of my agudal, but I don't have it. So thankfully, our contemporary rabbis in the last 50 to 100 years have tried to help us out. And if you thought there was going to be uniformity on this, you guessed it, there isn't. Here is the lack of uniformity on this position. We'll start with Rav Tuchachinsky, who says, without a bracha, you're looking at 2.3 pounds. With a bracha, just under 3.5 pounds. The Chazon Ish, which everything's always bigger, 2.65 pounds. If you make something as big as that, you need to take without a bracha. And with a bracha, it's got to be almost 5 pounds of flour. Rav Chaim Na'eh, 2.67 pounds without, 3.66, 3 2/3 pounds with. Hacham Ovadia Yosef, interesting, very close shitot here. 3.3 without, 3.44 with a bracha. Carries on, Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, 3.53 without, 5.49 pounds to make a beracha. And Rav Hershel Schechter of the OU and Yeshiva University, 3 pounds without, 5 pounds with. And guess what? In America, what do people like? People like Rav Schechter's position. Why? It's 5.00 pounds. It's the easiest position in the world. And guess what? If it's less than that, just take it without making the bracha, no problem, whether it's more or less than 3. But this is the craziness of this all. If you imagine all these positions, 5.5 pounds or 3.5 pounds, but it seems that if we are Sephardic, when we're holding by Hacham Ovadia Yosef, we should be careful to this shita of 3.44 pounds, as opposed to this more modern YU position of 5 pounds. And therefore, we should be careful to do that. And so maybe, although I'm playing a little bit here with my 43.2 eggs and my fingers and everything else, that, yeah, if our poskim have decided that it's 3.5 pounds, we should be careful. And if it's more than 3.5 pounds, that we should make the bracha, rather than saying, I'm going to go with Rav Schechter because it's 5 pounds even, and it's a nice, easy way to establish it. Now, the Gemara here in Memchet Amud Bet says, Amar Rabbi Yosef in Psachim, Hane Nashe Didan Nahug lemefa kfiza kviza lepischa. And this is a very interesting thing, which is what happens if I'm not having company, or maybe I'm only making challah for Friday night. It's a small family, and I have no way of making a large enough amount of challah to make a beracha. Am I allowed to, ideally, lechatchila, make challah, so make bread on Shabbat, which doesn't require me taking challah with a beracha? The Gemara here says, our wives, or these wives, normally bake kefitza by kefitza, which is less than the 5/4 or even the 7/4, which would be required to do the challah with the beracha. So Amale Abaye, so Abaye said to him, "My datcha, what do you think? Lechumra, are they being strict here by using these smaller measurements?" Says the Gemara, Chumra da'ateh lidei kulahu. This stringency of being careful to make small quantities because they were worried about some of the dough becoming chametz actually leads to a leniency. Because by doing so, one takes one out, one removes one's position from having to take challah, at least with a beracha. And so therefore Shulchan Aruch codifies and says, Asur la'asot isato pachot k'shi'ur kedei lehavkia mimenu chiyuv challah. One should be very careful, says Maran, not to take just under the threshold and say, you know what, if Hacham Ovadia Yosef says 3.44 pounds, I'm going to make 3.43 pounds of challah in order to exempt oneself from making a bracha. Likewise, one shouldn't say, I'm going to take 4.95 pounds so I don't have to follow Rav Shechter's position. One shouldn't do that. Okay? One shouldn't take just under the amount to remove ourselves from that minimum shi'ur. However, the Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Epstein says, if someone needs to make 5/4, one should not then break it up into two separate sections in order to avoid himself or herself from needing to take challah. Unless they genuinely have no need to make that. So it's saying you can't do harama. I can't do this as a legal fiction and say, I don't really need to make challah. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to divide it into two and exempt myself. No, you can't do that. It has to be, you know what? It's only Larry and Lisa for Friday night dinner. So Lisa's making a small amount of challah because there's only two of them, not, oh, it's my family. And the Rabisa says, well, let me make Friday night's challah separate from Shabbat lunch's challah so that we don't need to make a beracha, and so that one shouldn't do. It has to be the amount of challah you're making, you don't need to do it. Sharon.
Question. When I make challah, I usually make quite a bit, but I have to make it in several batches just because my mixer only holds so much at once. So I'm actually making two smaller batches, but I'm putting it together and I'm letting it rise all in one bowl and then do. So is that considered two separate batches, in terms of taking challah, or is it all considered one?
So Sharon, on that one, I would say that completely goes on your da'at. In your mindset, when you're making it, you're having in mind it's all one. And so therefore, even though you're separating it, I would say it's one batch and you're making it all together. You just don't have a big enough mixer. If you had the SPH mixer, it would be one batch. And so therefore, it's depending what your mindset is. If your mindset, on the other hand, was, oh, let's divide this up into two to exempt myself from making a beracha, that would be the problem which the Aruch HaShulchan there is mentioning. So to summarize, and this is what we didn't get to finish off last week. So there's 5 categories or 5 criteria that are required in order to me to need to make a beracha. Number 1, it needs to be from the 5 grains. Number 2, it needs to be one of the 7 liquids. Number 3, the dough is needed to be baked in the oven or on the stove. Number 3, the batter needs to be thick. If it's thin, I don't have to make challah. And number 5, it's got to be enough challah, it's got to be enough flour that I need to make a beracha. Okay. We're now going to fly through. That's the summary of everything that we did last week. Boom, boom, boom. And then there's a whole question there. We're going to skip all of that. And we're going to start Hafrashat Hallah number 2. Here we go. That's what we couldn't get through last week. Here we go. Who separates the challah? Now, here is a great question, which is, who is the balabayit? Who owns the flour? Is it me? Or is it the Rubisa? Is it Larry or is it Sharon? Is it Larry? Is it Lisa? Who owns the challah? Or is it the person who always makes the challah? Or let's say, for example, we'll go a bit more complicated. Let's say it's neither husband nor wife. What about children? Can children do this? Do they have to be over bar or bat mitzvah? What about, can I have someone who's helping in the house? Let's say some staff. Can they make can they take challah on my behalf? All of these discussions, all these questions we're going to see in this part. So I want to go into the Ben Ish Chai. The Ben Ish Chai says here in source number 2, V'yaseh zot ha'ish be'atzmo lekayem pam achat hafrashat challah biyado. So here, the Ben Ish Chai says, even in his time in Iraq, in the 19th century, it was pretty common practice that women were doing the majority of the baking of the challah. But he said, at least once a year, especially during the time between Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, during Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, the man of the house should separate the challah. That he should add 1 extra merit into his own merits, Kodem Yom Kippurim, before Yom Kippur. The Shulchan Aruch says, "En mafrishin challah belo reshut bal ha'isa." Challah cannot be separated without the permission of the dough's owner. Okay, so therefore we have to know who owns the dough and whether husband and wife can do this interchangeably or the other scenarios. Says the Rama, Shnei shutafin, if you have 2 partners, 2 owners, ein tzrichin litol reshut ze mizeh. Neither needs permission from the other. Aval acher, but a 3rd person, tzarich litol reshut mishnehem. That person will need to ask permission from both of them. Mihu, im natan reshut la'acher lahafrish, afilu ba'odo kemach mo'il, af al pi she'adayin lo nitchayev. However, if he, the owner, gives permission to another to separate, even before the flour is turned into dough, it is valid, although there is not yet an obligation to separate. Now, this is one of those classical cases is, can I appoint the Rubisa or Kochava to separate challah before the flour has been made into dough? So I'm saying I come home with, I've just gone to cash and carry, I bought the 10-pound bag of flour, and I say to them, okay, there's the flour, do as you will, no problem, go for it. Or do I have to give my reshut, do I have to give permission the moment that the flour has been turned into dough? Seems to be here from the Ramah that one does not have to wait till it becomes dough. You can make that you can give over that permission straight away. This rule, though, does not limit a woman's ability to separate challah without her husband's awareness, since with regard to this mitzvah, she has the status of the true owner of the dough. Consequently, the Or Zarua and the Terumat Hadeshen, two Ashkenazic Rishonim, rule that a woman has the ability to appoint another to separate the Hallah. The poskim debate if a domestic employee or any other third party may assume license to separate Hallah even without being formally appointed to do so, if there is some concern that the dough will be ruined if it is not baked immediately. The Rama adopts the position of the Trumat Hadeshen, according to whom the person may separate the Hallah. Why? Due to the principle of Zachin la'adam shelo befanav. We wish to give merit to a person who is not in front of us, i.e., one may benefit another in his absence because we assume that they would want this done for them. Because why wouldn't they want this done for them? The third party can thus become the person's agent for performing formal tasks, as in this case, it is to the owner's benefit that the dough is properly separated. As we see here, if we know that it is a benefit to the dough's owner, im yadinan dezechuthu lebal ha'isa, as in the case of dough that is apt to spoil, mitkalkelet, mutar litol challah belo b'shuto. One is allowed to take challah even without him giving permission. Why? Because we take it as that is benefiting him even in his absence. V'chein mesharetet shebabayit, a domestic employee in the home, yechola litol challah belo reshuto. Even she can take challah without his explicit permission. Since she is accustomed to being given permission to do this task. It goes without saying that he would be happy with her to do this. We're going to skip through this complicated ktsot, and we're going to carry on to contemporary halacha with the Yalkut Yosef, who is quoting his father, Hacham Ovadia Yosef. With the status of domestic employee subject to some controversy, the Yalkut Yosef argues that a mashkiach, a kashrut supervisor, should take for granted that he has license to separate the challah even without explicit permission. So let's say, for example, at SBH, they're doing the bazaar, and we need to know if challah had been taken. As the mashkiach who's on watch there, it would be part of their job to make sure that challah is taken if one of these doughs is being made into challah, into bread. And if it's into something which is not bread, but is something like in similar form, then one should take challah just without a beracha. Again, because there's no problem there in taking a handful of it just to make sure that we have removed any doubt possibly, especially if we're dealing with this thick dough that we talked about last week. Let's skip on. Now, what about a child? Can a child take challah for his parents or her parents? Says the Mishnah, Katan shelo hivi shtei sa'arot. If a child has not yet reached one of the signs of adulthood, Rabbi Yehuda Omer trumatot teruma. Rabbi Yehuda says that person's teruma is still teruma. Rabbi Yossi Omer im ad shelo ba le'onat nedarim ein terumatot teruma. If that child does not reach the time when they can make vows, which is normally considered to be 1 year below bar or bat mitzvah, ein terumatot teruma. So you've got a 9 or 10-year-old, then their teruma would not count. But once they reach that threshold of 11 for a girl or 12 for a boy, then their teruma would count. And that's how Shulchan Aruch says it. Katan shigia le'onat nedarim, afa pi shelo hivi shtei sa'arot. A child who is 11 for a girl and 12 for bar mitzvah, 12 for a boy, even if they've not had full signs of puberty, v'lo na'aseh gadol, and not yet bar bat mitzvah, im taram terumatot teruma. If they did do teruma, it would count. However, there are some people who should not do so, and these are they. Chamisha lo yatrumu. 5 types of individuals should not do truma. V'im taramu ein trumatan truma. And if they did do truma, then it doesn't count. And that is specifically here, Nochri Shetaram et Shel Yisrael. A non-Jew cannot do Terumah for a Jew. Afilu Birshut, even if the Jew gives permission, Ein Terumato Terumah. And this is because a non-Jew cannot be your Shaliach. Similarly, what about a Jew who is not observant, who's someone who breaks Shabbat? Are they allowed to do the terumah? Again, here the Mishnah Berurah says that they should not do so, especially when it comes to breaking Shabbat. That this is something, even if they're not doing it as an act of rebellion, it's not a good practice. So normally when it comes to someone being mafresh challah, someone who's taking the dough, one should have an observant person doing it rather than someone, even if they're very traditionally minded and they know, but they drive to synagogue every week, that shouldn't be the person, even if they're very careful in the kitchen. They shouldn't be the person who is taking the truma. Just going through a little quicker tonight than we did last time. Now, what about separating challah on Shabbat and Yom Tov? So the sages prohibited a number of things on Shabbat and Yom Tov, such as something which is metaken, which is fixing or correcting, a creative act that corrects a problematic status. Although these acts do not otherwise constitute a melacha, a forbidden creative labor, strictly speaking. In light of this general approach, the rabbis also forbade the separating of the assorted tithes and challah on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and this ruling is recorded by the Rambam in the passage below. As he says here, nor may terumah and the tithes be separated on Shabbat, for this resembles consecrating the produce one is separated, and also because through this procedure one makes the produce fit. Kemataken oto, and you're fixing it, you're making it fit on Shabbat. Shulchan Aruch says, "V'lo mafrishin terumot u'maasrot." We do not separate terumot and masrot on Shabbat. The Magen Avraham says in his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, and invokes the Rambam's second reason that such action resembles being metaken, and the Mishnah Berurah notes that separating challah has the same status as separating trumot and maasrot, and says v'lo mafrishin the dameh lemetaken, because it's similar to fixing it and making it fit to go. And there's a little bit of a biography there on the Magen Avraham, Avraham Gombina. Okay. And it says here, Mishnah Berurah, Trumot u'Maasrot, v'hu hadin leChallah. And so is true also for taking Challah on Shabbat. Now, what happens if someone separates Trumot and Masrot or Challah on Shabbat despite this prohibition? According to the Mishnah Berurah, if one did so b'mezid, intentionally, the rectified produce or dough is prohibited by virtue of rabbinic penalty until after Shabbat. But if it was done b'shogeg, unintentionally, without full awareness, there is no penalty whatsoever. Okay, we're going to go a little faster through this. Okay. Here's a nice piece of musar, especially for the husbands, which is when it comes to preparations done before Shabbat, and you want to make sure that everything's done properly right before Shabbat begins, one should do so in a nice way rather than shouting these things. He says in the Mishnah, there are three things that a person needs to say to his household on Friday evening as it gets dark. Isartem, have you separated the tithes? Eravtem, have you prepared the Eruv? Hadliku et haner, have you lit the Shabbat candles? And it says here, just before Shabbat starts, one should do so in a soft voice. Have you done everything properly? Hafrashat Hallah, have you taken the Hallah? Have you done so? All these things should be done nicely. And where do we get this from? A Gemara in Gitin on Vav Amud Bet, which says that these three things need to be done, need to be done in a calm and soft way, in order that the family members should do so happily, rather than doing so out of fear or out of fear of punishment. So now that we've done all this, how exactly do we do Hafrashat Hallah? What is the beracha? What exactly is involved in all of this? Now, this is going to be a little bit surprising because, again, can I make this? I'm being recorded. Can I say this? I didn't know the beracha for taking Hallah, because you're going to see here, it's actually going to present 3 or 4 different types of brachot to make. So we'll have a look at this. Hold on to your seat. It's not like, what's the bracha when you wake up and you wash your hands? No, everyone knows that. This one's actually very interesting. So have a look at this. The Ben Ish Chai says a beautiful custom that women had the custom to give tzedakah right before they take the challah. The kodem tevilat mitzvah had lakat haner, and they do so. They give tzedakah before they take challah, before going to the mikveh, and before lighting Shabbat candles. The simanim chana, and the siman to remember this is chana. Chet for challah, nun for nida, and hey for hadlaka. Beautiful thing there in the Ben Ish Chai. Now, what is the bracha? The Pitchei Tshuva writes, the Hafrashat Hallah eina mitzvah kol kach. It's not such a, and I like the translation here, formal mitzvah. The eino oseh ela letaken ma'achlo, because you're only doing it to finish or to make the food permitted. Lahachi mutar levarech miyushav, and therefore one does not need to stand, and one can do so sitting. However, the Yeshuot Yaakov pushes this off, and he argues, and he says, wherever possible, one should do so standing up, and one should not do it sitting. Now, what's the bracha itself? Says Harambam, Asher kiddeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehafrish challah. 2 words, lehafrish challah. What's missing there?
Min ha'isa.
Thank you, Sharon. Min ha'isa. This was I was just talking to the Rabisa this afternoon. We went down for a walk down on Lincoln Park. I said, wait a minute, there's 2 words missing from the beracha. What have I been missing all this time? And again, I'll be honest, I don't make this, I've never made this bracha because I don't take it, or that's not true. I've made this bracha 1 or 2 times when I've acted as mashkiach at SPH, but generally it's not something that I'm involved in. So Harambam says, just to say, lehafrish challah, and that's true whether you're in Israel or in the diaspora. So what's going on? Says the Smag, you know what the bracha is? Lehafrish teruma. Does anyone make that bracha? Shulchan Aruch says, Asher kiddeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehafrish teruma. The bracha of Maran is lehafrish teruma. The Rama adds there, by the way, you can also say lehafrish challah. So where do we get this idea of making the beracha of lafrish challah min ha'isa? Where do we get that from? This you find in Mishpatei Eretz, which says here, the prevalent custom nowadays among Ashkenazim is to say lafrish challah, though some do use the text of the Shulchan Aruch. And it says as follows: Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam shekidshanu v'tzivanu lehafrish challah, v'yesh omrim lehafrish truma, v'yesh nahagu lomar, like Sharon said, lehafrish challah min ha'isa. And the Taz writes that the custom is to say lehafrish challah min ha'isa. Okay, so that seems to be the Ashkenazic approach, is lehafrish challah min ha'isa. The Kaf HaChaim says, and this is the position endorsed by Hacham Ovadia Yosef, lehafrish challah teruma. Okay, so I want to say something here very carefully, and I learned something new, and we don't have to be ashamed when we learn something new. When we say lehafrish challah min ha'isa, which I thought was the beracha, That is the position of the Ashkenazim. That's the Taz. That seems to be the Ashkenazic position. The Sephardic position seems to be to say, Lehafrish chala teruma. Now, what should one do if one does it differently? Can one rely on growing up having learned one way and doing it the Ashkenazic way? Or if they were Sephardic, do they need to change when they marry and become Ashkenazi? Do they need to change? I think Torat minhag dinhu, that the minhagim that we grow up with are fine. And so therefore, not a problem if one is doing the Ashkenazic version versus the Sephardic version. Certainly one would not need to change. And if one would need to change, I wouldn't say that they need to do they wouldn't need to do a, what's it called, a hatarat nidarim. Now, I was just thinking about this. In the Zechut Yosef, there are a number of berachot, I think, in the back of here. It's interesting to see what Chazan Ezos has listed here for the Sephardic way of taking it. So if I can find it, maybe I can find it here. 1 second. Look at that. So Chazan Ezos has the Sephardic one, lehafrish chala teruma. Okay, and then when you take the dough, you say harei zo chala. This is the dough. So again, if ever you are in doubt, always ask Chazan Ezos. He has it right here. So again, you've got me on the video. You got me there. I didn't know this until this afternoon. And so you're in good company if you have been doing it differently. The Rubisa asks, linguistically, philosophically, what do you think the difference in the wording implies? Let me have a look. So, lehafrish chala teruma versus lehafrish chala min ha'isa. I think that what it's saying is that you're saying that this is part of being metaken, the chala, to making it permissible. One is describing it. I'm taking a piece from the dough. That's the Ashkenazic beracha. And the other one is saying, what is this thing called? It's called, this is part of the teruma. And that's why it's lehafrish chala teruma. Okay? I hope that answers that question. Now, let's carry on a little bit more. How much dough do I need to take? Now, again, this is another one where we're going to figure this out. The Harambam says, mitzvah taseh lafish teruma min ha'isa lekohen. It's a positive mitzvah to separate the teruma from the dough and give it to the kohen. As it says, Rishit harisotechem chala tarima teruma. From the first of your dough, you shall separate a loaf as a gift. And this dough, this first, does not have a measurement in the Torah. Even if you would just take a barley's worth, that you've done enough. So how much is it on a rabbinic level? They say it's either 1/24th of the dough if it's for home use, or 1/48th if you are a baker and you are selling it in the marketplace. That's the Mishnah in Masechet Chala. The Ramah says, Mikol Makom, even all that said, Nohagin Nitol Kazayit. We don't take 1/24th or 1/48th, we just take a Kazayit's worth. The Birkei Yosef says that even nowadays, one should be careful and take this 1/24th, or at least 1/48th. However, you'll see he concludes and says, Aval lo ra'iti v'lo shamati sheshum chasid b'dorenu noheg bekach. Even though I just said that ideally one should take at least 1/48th of the dough, I have never seen anyone or heard any pious person in our generation who follows this. But Ya'akut Yosef writes that one may separate a small amount, even the lechatchila. However, once a year, one should try to separate the 1/24th or even the 1/48th, at least once a year, to fulfill that position. See that there in source 32. Carrying on a little bit. The order of the beracha and the hafrasha. Says the Shulchan Aruch, Hamafrish teruma gedola or terumat maaser mevarech kodem sheyafrish. When you're going to separate the teruma or the terumat maaser, you should do so. You should recite the bracha before doing it. Why? The kol hamitzvot mevarech alehen ovel asiyatan. Because we have this concept that we always make the bracha before we do the action. Following the bracha, one should separate the piece of dough taken as challah, and then one should declare that this is the challah, as we saw in Chazan Ezos in the Zechut Yosef Siddur. What happens if you were to forget to recite the bracha? Here it says, V'lokeh chaticha b'nafach kazayit. He takes a piece in the volume of a kazayit, min habatzek from the dough, or min ha'ma'afer, or from the baked good. V'yeshomim shori lomar harei zo challah. And he should say, this is the challah, or harei ze teruma, or this is the teruma. Im shachach levarech. But if he forgot to make the beracha, v'kava kvar tzachallah, and he already took the challah, eino yachol levarech. He cannot make the beracha after the fact. Ach ma she'asa chal v'tiken, because that which he did has already taken over, and he's already fixed the dough or the baked good for, and it's now fit for consumption. She'beracha lo me'akevet. The blessing does not hold it back. And if one was to make such a bracha, there would be a bracha she'enat tzricha, a bracha which you do not need to do, and therefore there would be a bracha levatala. So what do we do with this challah dough now that we've made the bracha? Bizman hazeh she'ein isa Torah, since the dough is not pure, because we don't live in purity, because we have the concern of tumat hamet, we all come into contact with the impurity of tumat met. Mafrishin challah, we take the challah, we can't give it to a kohen. V'sarfinota, we have to burn it. How do we burn it? Says the Ramam, it's the custom in all these countries, she'ein mafrishin rak challah achat belo shi'ur, v'sarfinota, is that one separates one challah that is less than the minimum amount, and we burn it. And the custom is to cast it into the oven before baking the bread. Nowadays, most ovens don't consist of a fire alone, in which one can simply dispose of the challah by burning it directly. Consequently, one who places the challah in the oven confronts a problem that it may render the oven non-kosher before getting burned due to its forbidden status. And a number of different customs exist as to how to avoid this problem when disposing the challah. We don't want to, chas v'shalom, by mistake, eat that small piece. So it says here, nohagim, the custom is to burn the challah on top of the flame of the stove or to place it into the oven, but not together with food. And then he says here, the Kovetz Bibeit Halevi, who writes that even according to the Kitzur Shel Aruch, that one burns the challah in the oven before baking the bread. That is true in their ovens, but in ours, where there is no actual fire, one shouldn't do that. It's forbidden. So the oven does not absorb the forbidden flavor from the challah and make the whole oven forbidden. Rather, what should we do? One should not rely upon the wrapping of the challah in foil and placing it in the oven with the baked food. And so the OU gives another of possibilities of what to do. He says preferably one should put the challah into an open fire and therefore burn it on the stove top. The Ramah records the practice of burning the challah in the fire inside the oven. So this is not very practical in modern ovens. One possible alternative is to place the small piece of dough in the middle of a burner on a gas stove, that's what I just said, and burn it to a crisp. it goes without saying that care must be taken to avoid any possibility of fire. Alternatively, one can place the piece of dough into the oven until it's completely burnt. When doing so, it's important to keep in mind a few points. And again, it goes into this. You can have a look there. The Minchat Yitzchak says another option, which is common, is to put it in a bag and throw it in the garbage. Okay, and then you can have a look there. The Yalkut Yosef offers the same suggestion, and he says as follows: but if it's impossible to burn the challah, the one separated, one should wrap it well in paper and throw it into the garbage. Likewise, after one has burned the challah, one may throw it in the garbage, since the mitzvah has already been performed and there is no degradation of the mitzvah. So again, this is a question which I do get with some familiarity, and that's why I recommend to burn it on the stovetop, wrap it up, and throw it in the garbage. And if you're worried about putting in the stovetop, just wrap it and throw it out, and that's the easy way to deal with it. But as I said, this whole halachot, it's a little bit more complicated than when first meets the eye.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So you're saying that putting it in the oven, wrapped up, and burning it is not a good thing to do it?
Wrapping it up, yes. The concern is if you don't wrap it up, then the aroma of that piece is going to be absorbed into the walls of the oven. And then when you then bake your bread, that bread is going to absorb the aroma. And even though we've given classes that aroma is not really a thing, he said it's best to avoid that. So your situation, Sharon, of wrapping it in foil is fine. The question is, what do you do next? You still then need to take that piece of dough in the foil and then throw it out. So you've got to avoid that situation that chas v'shalom, someone might then come to eat it, or that you're having the dough uncovered in the oven. Okay? Just a little one of those things where you don't really think about it. It's like you wouldn't think that dough is the smell of that dough is going to impact the kashrut status of the oven or the food being cooked in it. What happens if one separates challah, but then accidentally mixes it into the rest of the dough or places it into the oven uncovered together with the dough? Has one now made the oven and the dough non-kosher? So it's happened before. The Rama writes that in such a case, one can actually perform a type of hatarat nedarim upon the challah, which essentially retroactively undoes the hafrashat. One can then separate the challah a second time. Now, this is beautiful halachic ingenuity. You know what we would say today? Just throw it out and start again. But because our rabbis were so concerned back then of our money, of wasting food, of all these things, they came up with this beautiful ingenuity of annulling that first separation and doing a separate one. It says here, if you don't have 101 to nullify it, if one has not yet eaten from the dough, one can ask a sage, and he will permit your vow. And he should then take a different piece of challah. But Hacham Abad Yosef comments that one should not recite the beracha on this second hafrasha, since if one does so, it will become clear retroactively that the first one was in vain. And so therefore, you take challah the second time, just don't make a bracha, because that would make the first one a bracha levatala. A related question arises with regard to one who did not separate challah before the bread or other food was baked. In this case, we already learned in the first shiur on challah that one may still perform the hafrashat afterwards, though in Israel it must be done before one eats. As we saw here, if one did not separate challah from the dough, I would think that one should not separate challah from the bread. The verse states, and it will be when you eat from the bread of the land, indicating in any case, where you eat bread, the obligation of hafrasha should still be fulfilled, and that's how the Maran says in Shulchan Aruch, "Im lo hifrisha challah batzek." If one did not separate challah from the dough, ela afa hakol, rather he baked everything. Harei zeh mafrish min hapat. You can take some from the loaf of bread, and you can take it at the end. If the challah got lost before being burned, the Sefer Kashrut rules that one has fulfilled one's obligation and one does not need to do a second hafrasha. And that is, as we've gone through mightily, we have now finished that whole second section, and I'm very pleased to say we're now almost back on schedule. And I can tell you what fun we have in store for next week.